Okay, so welcome back. We're in the third lesson, I guess, or not third lesson, but the third time we're doing this. So, I want to. I should have told all of y'all last time to read up on lessons from the book. I think everybody should have had the book by now. If you don't, just let us know. So we should have read up chapters 2 and 3. That's what we are covering. But I forgot to remind everybody. So if you read ahead of this in these chapters, now what we'll be covering is pretty much in line with what's in the book. There's not a whole lot extra. I'll probably bring in some illustrations and some more explanation. But for the most part, we'll be sticking to the book. So if you read ahead, then it'll help you to grasp a little bit. It'll help you to maybe formulate some questions you might have. So before I forget, I just want to ask you to next week, please read chapter 4 in the book. It's called, the title of the chapter is You Are in Charge. Okay, You Are in Charge. So please do read that up. These are all, these are not really very long chapters. If you look at chapter 4, for example, it's, it's basically around maybe 7 or 8 pages, 10 pages maximum, 9, 10 pages. So I suggest that you all read that. It will certainly help you as we go through the class, to have read it ahead of time. And please do ask questions on the chat. Okay, I'm going to keep my chat open here so that I can see it. If you have questions, you can send it to me privately, or if you don't have an issue with others seeing who you are, do it publicly. It doesn't matter. Please do feed your questions and we'll try to address them. So we're going to start off talking today. Today's subject, I'll get to that. It's shaping influences and Godward orientation. But just to recap a little bit, we have these. Just to revise a little bit from the last couple of weeks. So 3 key concepts, right? One is authority, that describes a parent's relationship to the child. We'll talk more about that next week in the chapter called You Are in Charge. The second concept is shepherding, right? Which is what does the parent do, right? Authority is the parent's relationship to the child. What does a parent have to do? It is to shepherd the child, right? Or shepherd the child's heart. That's the title of this thing. And then the third thing is the centrality of the gospel, that the central focus of parenting is not about raising good kids. It's not about, although that might be an outcome you achieve and you want to achieve, but that's not the central theme or the central goal. The central goal is to infuse the gospel, the good news of salvation and transformation, through the death of the Lord Jesus Christ. And that's why, this course is not a secular course based on, concepts from psychology and psychiatry and all these other fields, but rather it is founded on the Word of God. And in fact, as a result of that, you might find some things that we talk about that may not align with the latest and greatest thinking, and we know that thinking tends to change, right, over time. So but the central goal here is really to focus. The central focus of our parenting that we're talking about here is to get the child, to be aligned with the gospel, to get that gospel message. The message of man's sin, the message of God's love, the message of God's condemnation of his son, the man's sin and the death that comes from it, and God's love which led him to give up his only begotten son so that anyone who believes in him will have everlasting life. And then the transformation power of the gospel, once you have believed, okay, and then he continues to work in your heart to change you, to make your character more like the character of the Lord Jesus. the entirety of the gospel. And that's what, that's what your goal as a parent, in the 16, 17, 18 years that you have with your child is you want to shape them, you want to shepherd them, and get them to really understand the truth of the gospel. Okay? And we'll talk a little bit about it today, where, if we don't have the right goals, we end up with children who really do not have that Godward orientation. Okay? Their orientation ends up being to do things to please people, and some of those things might be good things. They might seem like godly things from the outside, but their heart is really not right. And a lot of believer families end up with kids, their kids end up in that state, and we ourselves have experienced that in many cases. So last week we talked about the heart, right? About how behavior comes from the heart, right? And our goal in raising our children should be to address the heart issues. Okay, so that should be the focus, not behavior. We want the right behavior that comes from the right attitude in the heart. Okay, the right attitude of the heart. And fixing aberrant behavior, can be done without it coming from the right attitude in the heart. So you might have children who have the wrong attitude in the heart, but they do the right thing simply because of social pressure, or because they don't want to get in trouble, or they know that makes them look good and they want to look good, right? But the key thing you have to get to is get beyond what you see on the outside to what's really in the heart. And what that last verse there on that slide says, Matthew 15:8, the Lord Jesus himself says about the Pharisees and the scribes. He says, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. What the Lord wants is our hearts to be close to him. And same thing we want, or we ought to want for our children, is that, when they grow up and leave us, that their heart is in the right place. Their behavior, needs to come from that heart. And sometimes their behavior may not always be exactly what we would like, or maybe it's not what people want to see. But the question we have to get to is their heart in the right place? What is motivating that behavior? What does it show about their attitude? Okay, so we're going to talk today about two things that affect children. Okay, one is the relationship of the child to the shaping influences of life. So, when we go through life, there are these various influences that shape us. Okay, all of you, all of us, myself, all of you have been shaped by various things, circumstances in your life, right? So, where you grew up, how many kids were in your family, what your parents did, whether they were believers or not believers, whether you grew up in in a certain socioeconomic level versus not, whether you have to struggle, whether your parents have to struggle through life versus you grew up basically having what you wanted, living in luxury. All of these things shape us, right? And some of these are things that can be controlled. Some of these are things that you cannot be controlled. Shaping influences go beyond just the things that you can control. So, there are other influences that happen in our life that we can't control. So, for example, maybe it's a death in the family. Maybe it's some kind of a crisis or a trauma that happens in the family, right? Things that we can't really control, and very often you'll find kids later on in life that, while we may not understand it, the fact is that they get severely influenced by those things. So, for example, if you didn't have a stable home life, you had abusive parents, whether physically or verbally or whatever, right? All of these things have an influence on life, and we'll look at some of those. It's very important to understand this, and I'll talk about this a little later. And the reason it's important is because we tend to go in one of two extremes. As parents, sometimes we assume, on one extreme, we assume that if we get all of the shaping influences right, the child will turn out right? So if let's just take, our typical, scenario, right? So when we want our kids to go to Sunday school, we want them to memorize the the verses, we want them to pray, we want them to build all these good habits, right? And we think that if we surround them with that, we take them to church all the time, and we do all of those things. Those are all good things, okay? I'm not suggesting we shouldn't do those, of course. But, one mistake that we make is assuming that that alone somehow guarantees that, your child will turn out right. So we've got plenty of examples that we can, probably all of us can think about, where kids who grew up in really godly environments, what we would have regarded as godly families. Now, we may not have seen fully what was going on behind the scenes, but nevertheless, at least outwardly, it seemed, things were very good, right? And then later on, they leave. I mean, I remember there's one cousin of mine, much younger than me. I remember her from the day she was born, and how she was brought up in a godly home of parents. Her father was an elder in the church at some point, and she was like she was really doted on, and she was number one in the Sunday school in terms of memorizing verses. And from the age of 2 or 3, her mother would teach her all these songs, and she would sing these songs when people would come to the house, and all these kind of things. And growing up, she was somebody that we all just adored and said, oh, what a great kid she is. And then, fast forward many, many years later, she went completely off the deep end, okay, to the other side, where, today she is, doesn't believe in God. Not only that, but doesn't believe in the God of the Bible, but believes in a sort of syncretistic, new age kind of religion, and just completely has rejected, Christianity. All right. Now, how does that happen, right? So these kind of things make very clear to us that while shaping influences and the environment that we build around our children is important, and we should do that, that in and of itself doesn't guarantee the end result. Okay. So that's one thing, one extreme of how we respond to these shaping influences. The other side is we sort of assume that, that a child is completely determined by shaping influences. What happens is that we assume that if they've had a bad situation, that they can never come out of it, right? There are things that they can control, and we use it to explain things away. Okay? Both of these are sort of extreme positions, and not really the way that we should look at it. The other set of issues is around the relationship of the child to God. That's the Godward orientation of the child. So from the time a child is born, he or she has got a certain understanding of God. Okay? We're all born with that. All humans are born with that. And, how you shape that orientation, or how you mold that orientation, ultimately determines how they respond to the shaping influences. So if I go back to that example, while that child being brought up was taught to do all the right things, okay, the fact is that her heart, was not with God, okay, and maybe even, and I'm speculating a little bit, a lot of those things that she was doing and getting the praise of people, perhaps that became, an idol, okay, as she was growing up, that those things had become an idol in your life, okay, in the life of a child, where they do things for the praise of people, or to impress people. And what happens then is, when you move out of the environment of the church and the godly people, and you go out into the world, especially into college and things like that, you get in with another crowd, and if you are sort of worshiping that idol of people's approval and people's praise, whatever they praise or whatever they desire, you tend to go in that direction, right? Because whatever your orientation was never towards pleasing God. So that's why we need to understand the shaping influences. We need to make sure that our children have the right shaping influences in their life. But we also need to make sure that their hearts are molded towards the right orientation towards God. And that connects back with what we talked about last week, which is, out of the heart come the issues of life. So these are the two things we're going to talk about today. And so let me talk about shaping influences first. And by the way, if you have any questions, please do post them, on the chat. I'll try to address them as we go or at the end. So what are shaping influences? I've already described that a little bit. So these are events and circumstances in a child's development years that prove to be catalysts for making him the person that he is or she is. Okay. So again, these are things that happen and the environment that the child is in during their growing years, and these serve as catalysts. They have a deep influence on what happens with this child or who this child becomes. Okay, so and we'll look at them in a little bit more detail, and you can see these this little picture on the right there, which talks about some of those shaping influences, right? Like the structure of the family life, or the family values that the child grows with, or the roles in the family, or how the family responds to failure in their life, or the history of the family. What are the different circumstances and the events that happen in the family life. How does a family resolve conflicts in their lives? And the Bible, if we look to the Word of God, right, the Bible clearly says that that these shaping influences are important. Okay, they're important. If we look at some of the verses here, so Deuteronomy 6, we read that all the time when we do a dedication of a baby, right? And we're all familiar with it, right? It says, "O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and these things that that I've taught you, you shall teach them to your children and their children's children, and you shall put them on the doorposts and all of these kind of things," right? So that clearly tells us that God, the Bible and God acknowledges that these early experiences and the way that the child is brought up, the physical environment, the emotional environment around the child has an impact, right? Ephesians 6, right? Tells us that you are to raise your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, right? And when you do that, he or she will have a blessing, right? And children are to obey their parents, right? And fathers and mothers are to raise them in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Colossians 3 talks about the same thing. Okay? So what is your child's personality, his outlook on his or her outlook on life is very dependent on this, on his experiences, the experiences they go through, and how they react to those experiences. Okay, so as I said earlier, there are shaping influences that might be within our control, and there are things that are outside of our control. So, an example of something outside our control might be, let's say the family goes through a financial crisis where, the parents lose their jobs, they're unemployed, they have to live off savings, or they just have to live without much. There are other kids growing up around them who have, get all these presents on their birthdays and all these kind of things, and are living in plenty. Maybe the kids that go to school are in a very different kind of situation. And these things can also shape them, right? And some of those things are outside the control of the parents. So we just need to understand that. So let's look at each one of these. Okay, so what are some of the shaping influences related to family life, or the structure of family life? Okay, so what kind of family do you have? Now, many of our parents, for example, they grew up in a traditional family as opposed to a nuclear family. Nuclear family means that just have a father, mother, and children, right? Whereas traditionally, you sort of grew up in a home with everybody, with an extended family. Maybe your grandparents were there. We don't have that kind of situation anymore. The multi-generational family, the number of children. Okay, so the birth order of a child, is important. Okay, the personality of a child is often shaped by their birth order, and I get to see this, because I have 9 kids. Okay, and they all have different personalities. So I'll just take my firstborn, who might be on the thing here. She, if I can say this, she's very responsible, very independent, kind of person. And in many ways, that has to do with the fact that she was the firstborn. She had a lot of siblings, and the expectation was always there, and was that as she grew up, she would do things right to help with things in the home and all these kind of things. Whereas if I take the youngest guy, Josiah, he's completely different. He's used to having everything done for him. Okay, which is why I now get him to do stuff on his own, such as making his bed in the morning. Okay, in fact, the other day he asked me to pay him for making his bed. So I told him, well, if you pay me for sleeping in the bed, maybe I'll think about paying you for making the bed. So anyway, that's just a little humorous aside. But the point is that the birth order, the second one tends to be. This may not always be true. Okay, I'm generalizing a little bit. Okay? The second one tends to be a little bit quiet, typically because they're dominated by the firstborn. Okay, again, the age difference between children. Okay, the number of children. All of these things have an impact on the child, and they shape who the child is. So if you've got a child that's somewhere in the middle, and sometimes they tend to be sort of caught in the middle where. So if you take like my kids, okay, so if I've got 9 kids, so somewhere in the way, one of them will be like another firstborn, because the first 3 or 4 end up going away, and then the fourth person or somebody becomes sort of more like a firstborn, right? Because they got to take on more responsibility. So it's important to understand these things and how the families blend, how the personalities blend within the family, and all of these things can impact the child. Okay. And a lot of these are things that you can't control. The family you're born into, your birth order, right? Who your parents are, the background of your parents. These are things that you can't control. The structure of family life is generally, for the most part, things that are outside your control. It just sort of happens, right? It's what God allows. So you move on and you look at the role, the family roles. This has an influence. Okay, what is the role of the father and the mother? So, when we talk, and by the way, these shaping influences impact people even, when they become adults. If you talk to certain people, they have a certain image. So if you have we know the roles as they're defined in scripture, right? You have the man's role and the woman's role, father and mother role, and very often in certain families, you'll find that, the father, for example, is not very involved in the raising of children, right? It's a mother who does everything, okay, which is not really biblical, but that's the way it is. And what happens then is that when that child grows up and becomes a parent himself, he thinks that his role is not to get involved; it's his wife's role to do everything, right? What is it that children do? Okay, so if you grow up in a home where the shaping influences that as a child you never did any work. Okay, you always had servants do the work, or your parents did the work. As you grow up, you think you grow up with this influence that people are going to be there to do everything for you, right? You don't learn responsibility. Okay, so these kind of things can be, and of course, this is one that you can shape, right? And as we go through this, I want you to think about what can we shape and what can we not. The first set of things about the family structure, sort of a given, right? Not much you can do there. You just have to, what's important is how you respond to that and how you understand it, and then counteract some of the negatives that might be there, right? But when it comes to the roles, it's important that you model the right roles to your children, right? Because that influences them, okay? If, the way that the father treats his wife, the husband treats his wife, has an influence on how the boys growing up, how they deal with women, okay, how they respect women, whether they respect them or don't respect them, okay. So that's family roles. You look at family conflict resolution, okay. So how does the family deal with conflict? Some families don't want to talk about it, okay. They don't want to talk about the problems in their home. They just sort of hope that it goes away. They ignore the problems, right? Some will sit down and try to deal with them in a biblical manner, okay? Or some will try to solve it by power. That I'm the dad, I said so, that's the way it's going to be. Okay, so maybe it's conflict between husband and wife, maybe it's conflict between the parent and the child. um, how are these problems resolved? Does a family have a history of sitting down and working their way through problems? Do they have a history of going through through sitting down and discussing problems and resolving them? And then another one is the family values. Okay, and this is really important. Okay, what is important to the parents? What is the thing that causes a fuss, and what passes without notice? If you read the chapter, he talks about in this matter of family values, about things that he says. I recently asked a young lad of 10 what would get him into the most trouble: breaking a valuable vase or disobeying his parents' clear directive. Without a moment of hesitation, he said it would be far worse to break a cherished vase. So, how do you, as parents, respond to things that go wrong? Okay, do you make more of a fuss over character issues that your children evidence, or do you make a bigger fuss when they mess something up, or they do something to spoil your reputation? Do they get the impression that people are more important than things, or things are more important than people? Right? What are the philosophies and ideas that the child hears? So when they hear you talk about your job, what do they hear about how you deal with your boss? So when you think about, for example, authority, okay, how do you deal with authority? What do they hear from you about? Do they hear you always coming and complaining about your boss and about the government and about the police and about all these kind of things? Okay, so these are philosophies and ideas that children pick up. Okay, what do you get stressed over? What is it that causes you the most stress? Is it when you can't find something, or is it when a child does something that displeases you, or messes up your routine, or disturbs you when you don't want to be disturbed, right? Do you get stressed when one of the things we all get stressed over is we're late? Okay, so all of these things again constitute family values that shape the child. Okay, they're shaping influences. Where does God fit into the families, right? So, for example, your how often do you go to church? How important do you take it, right? Do you show up to church on time? That shows how important, because the child sees you rushing off to work because you can't be late. Okay, and then because you're always rushing to make sure that you get to work on time, but you don't have that same sense of urgency when you want to come to church, right? So what is the vibes, the signal that the child is getting from that? It is obviously that your work is more important than church, okay, more important than God in some ways, right? And these are the things that they pick up, right? So family values is something. It is a set of shaping influences that we do have a lot of control over. We can be very deliberate about this, and it's very important that as parents we are prayerfully doing, prayerfully setting these kind of values that our children see. Okay, and if we have things in our past, in the structure of family that cause negativity with our families today, we need to counteract those by making sure that we are shaping values that are very different. Now, what are the boundaries within the family? What is permitted? Okay, what are the limits within your family, right? What is allowed, what is not allowed, right? So all of these are aspects of family values. Okay, we talked about family roles and conflict resolution. And then how does a family respond to failure? How does a family respond when the children fail? So let's take an example that we can all maybe relate to. Your child fails an exam. Okay, this is obviously a big thing in the Indian culture. You want your child to get 90% or whatever, get an A plus. How do you make the child feel? Let's say the child, they're in Sunday school and they're supposed to go and do something. Okay, and they mess up. Okay, how do you respond to that? Right? Do you get mad at them? Do you make them feel foolish? Do you mock them? Do you compare them to other children, or do you encourage them? right? So this is really important as well. And these are influences that shape a child. Okay? As a child is growing up, if they feel that they can't fail, like when they fail, they're going to be, given, negative treatment. They're going to be, not made to feel foolish. Okay? Then they will develop this fear of failure, right? And that can be really hampering to them, right? But encouragement, right? Again, there's a difference between failure due to child not working or not doing their best or whatever, versus, this child does their best and they still fail, right? So you got to understand, whether it's grades, whether it's performances, whether it's all of these kind of things, the way that you respond to that is forming a shaping influence in the right life of the child. The history of the family, okay? History of finances, as I said earlier, how did the child grow up? Did they grow up with plenty, or did they grow up with, without that much, right? Has their family life been stable? Has there been constant change? Was there a death in the family? Did they lose a father or mother? All of these things can have, can influence the way that they think, and as we're going to see now, what's important is not so much, as I said, some of these you can control, some of these you can't control, right? But what is most important is how do we train the child, and how does the child respond to these things? And that's where, but before I get there, let me just talk about, I did allude to this earlier, the mistakes, right? One mistake in understanding shaping influence is assuming that the child is a helpless victim of the circumstances in which he was raised. In other words, we just say, oh, well, that child grew up without a father or without a mother, or had an abusive father who left them and went away, and therefore he's a helpless victim. What can you do, right? The other is a denier, saying that the child is unaffected. So you can say, well, that doesn't matter. Okay, so there's always a tendency, sometimes among Christians, say, well, it doesn't matter. God is in control of everything, and what happened to the child, he should be able to overcome that. Both of these are sort of extremes. Okay, so child rearing is not only about providing the best possible shaping influence. That's important. But, as I said earlier, good shaping influences will not automatically produce good children. As I give you an example there, and many of you know other examples where, children are brought up in the right way. Maybe they've been to church, they've done all the right things, parents have been godly people. Still, they're children. We've seen children of evangelists go off, in the opposite direction. But what is important is, how does a child respond, right? And that's where the shepherding comes in, is there are these circumstances, okay, what you can control, it's important that you control. What you can determine, it's important that you determine. But there are all these influences that come in the life of a child, and it's important that these are things that God allows in your life, and you and I as parents have to use these to train the child to deal with it, right? And we ourselves have to deal with it and respond to them in a way that allows that child to learn something about God and build this thing called Godward orientation. Okay, so Godward orientation of the child determines how he or she responds to shaping influences. Okay, so let's just turn to this passage in Proverbs chapter 9. I'll just read it here. Proverbs chapter 9, verses 7, 10. Okay, Proverbs 9, it says, he who corrects a scoffer gets shame for himself, and he who rebukes a wicked man only harms himself. Do not correct a scoffer, lest he hate you. Rebuke a wise man, and he will love you. Give instruction to a wise man, and he will be still wiser. Teach a just man, and he will increase in learning. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Okay, so what are these verses telling us? It's telling us that that correction and rebuke, right? Depends on the wisdom of the child, right? So if you give instruction to a wise man, if you rebuke a wise man, he will become wiser, right? If you teach a just man, he will increase in learning. And ultimately, wisdom comes from the fear of the Lord. So how do you make your children into wise children who will listen to rebuke it's by instilling in them this fear of the Lord, because that's the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Okay, and when we talk about Godward orientation, we're talking about who do children, what do they learn about God? What do they grow up understanding about God? And all children, if you go back to, David said, in sin did my mother conceive me. Okay, very often, we think children don't know anything. Okay, but children from the day they're born, they have a certain, certain something in their mind. If you go to Romans 1, 18 and 19, you can read this on your own. But it's talking about the state of man, right? Man is born in sin, right? And children either, when they go through circumstances, when they go through situations in their life, they either respond to God by faith or suppress the truth, right? And those who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, they, if I can just go to that passage, I'll just read that out. The wrath of God, this is Romans 1, 18, 19. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. Okay? So the tendency of the human heart is to suppress the truth of God. Okay, and we need to understand that our children are born with that tendency to suppress the truth of God, right? And so they either respond to God by faith or they suppress the truth. And it's our job as parents to bring out the truth and help them to understand the truth, help them to understand how God fits into that circumstance, which will be a shaping influence on them. But only when they understand that will they be able to shepherd their heart, right? And when you look at who God is, right? God is good, He's kind, He's holy. He has made all things for His glory. To know God is to know life, right? And when a child goes through a circumstance in their life, they can either respond to the goodness of God, the kindness of God, with delight, with love, with worship, wanting to know God and serve Him better, or they can respond by exchanging the truth for a lie. So worship and serve a created thing rather than the creator, and this is idolatry. So as your child is growing up, there's this conflict going on, between God and idols. Okay, and they are starting to develop certain things in their life that become idols for them, whether it's impressing other people, whether it's fear of other people, or whether it's love of stuff, okay, love of money, right? So idolatry that we have in our life today comes from things that developed while we were still children. Or they can respond to the goodness and kindness of God, and they can be thankful to God, they can learn to be content. All depends on how you help them respond to that, right? So the child may not always realize this when they're growing up, but they serve God or they serve idols. And when we look at some of these verses here, right? Psalm 58 verse 3, right? I mentioned that earlier. Even from birth, the wicked go astray. From the womb, they are wayward and speak lies. So very often parents don't want to talk to them because they think that, this stuff is too deep. Okay, we don't want to talk about sin. We don't want to even consider that maybe our children are sinners, right? But you have to have this understanding that your child is born in sin. They're not only born in sin, they're conceived in sin, right? Psalm 51:5, David says, surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me. Okay, so even a child in the womb, coming from the womb, is wayward and sinful. Okay, so, sometimes, we have this wrong idea that man becomes a sinner because he sins. That's not true, right? The truth of the word of God is that the man is a sinner and therefore he sins. He doesn't become a sinner because he sins. He sins because he is a sinner. And we need to, first of all, accept and understand that every child is a sinner, right? And we need to tune them toward this Godward orientation in dealing with the things that happen. So what are some of the idols? What are some of the idols in their life? The fear of man. So, when you start, and think about this as we're going through this, think about all the ways in which we instill this kind of idolatry into the life of our children, okay, into the thinking, the psyche of our children. Okay, fear of man. How do we do that? Okay, we tell them, well, you can't, say you've got somebody older, somewhat older kid, and they wear some clothes, and say you can't wear that clothes. Well, why not? But think about what people are going to say. Okay, what are we teaching them? We're teaching them the idolatry of fear of man. We're not explaining to them why that clothing may not be of a nature that honors God, right? Evil desires, lust, pride, conformity to the world, right? Trying to be more like the world. So you buy them the latest fashions and the latest kind of thing. What are you teaching them? That, you know what, these are the things that are fashionable in the world, so it's important that you have them, right? So as we respond in these ways, we are not giving them a Godward orientation. We're giving them more of an orientation towards the world and an orientation towards towards idolatry, right? Paul says that set your affections on things above and not on things below. Okay, so this is the importance of Godward orientation, and what does it mean for us in terms of raising children? Okay, so the implications for raising children are two things. I'll say one is, number one, that we provide the best possible shaping influences that we can, for the things that we control, right? So structuring of the home, it should be healthy, it should be constructive, it should give them stability, it should give them security. They should always feel secure at home. They should feel that their needs are their needs. We'll go back to our lesson on financial principles, right? Their needs are taken care of. Okay, the quality of the relationships in your home should reflect the grace of God and mercy for sinners. So the relationship between husband and wife, the relationship between you and the children. How do you teach your children or train them towards this godly orientation, okay, or Godward orientation? When you do something wrong, a lot of parents feel like they can't go and apologize to their children, when they have done something wrong, when they've gotten angry or they've lost their cool, right? To admit that they are also sinners. Okay, that helps children to understand that, my parents judge themselves by God's standard, and so I also need to do that as well, right? The quality of relationships in your home should reflect the grace of God and mercy for sinners. Punishments should be appropriate and reflect a holy God's view of sin. So, why do you punish the children? Is it because your ego has been hurt? Is it because you're worried about them embarrassing you? Or is it because they've done something sinful and God is a holy God and He hates sin, right? The values of your home should be scripturally informed. So again, what you spend money on, what kind of lavish lifestyle you live or don't, all of these things drive your value, right? So we need to take these shaping influences, especially the ones we can control, seriously, and we need to build these shaping influences in a way that are positive for the children. But more than that, we need to understand that shepherding a child's heart involves developing a Godward orientation, responding to shaping influences. Okay, so how do they respond to the goodness and mercy of God? How do they do that in faith and not in unbelief? How do they grow to love and trust the living God and not turn to idolatry and self-reliance, right? So simple things like when you're going through a difficult time, maybe you're struggling to put food on the table, okay? Or maybe you've lost your job, okay? Or maybe you've got some serious issue, a health issue in the family, a parent or another child has gotten sick with some kind of a terminal illness. How do you respond to that, right? So you can see, many families where children, when something like that happens, say a sibling dies, okay, due to an illness, right? It's very traumatic, and many children will sometimes, as they grow up, especially if they're a little older, that can become a pivotal event in their lives that takes them away from God, right? So they, because at that point in time, their view of God is such that, they think that that's unfair. Okay, what has happened is unfair. Why did God do that? Why did He allow that? Okay, and then they can turn away from the faith, right? So that's turning away from that Godward orientation. in responding to those shaping influences. So these are things that happen that we can't change, but it's very important that they turn to God, that we train their hearts, we impress upon them, and they see us relying on God in those circumstances. So the point I'll make here is just this, that there are a lot of things in our backgrounds that we can't control. There are a lot of things that we can control. The ones that we do, it's important that we do the right things there. But beyond that, what is more important than that is how we respond to that. The example that we set. And that's why Deuteronomy 6, God says that, you need to understand the word and you need to live by it, right? So that you can be an example to your children. Okay. And so your children look at you. So you cannot expect your children to be any more spiritual than you are. Okay. You cannot expect your children to respond to problems as they grow up any much differently than the way you do. Okay, so how do you respond to problems in your home? If that doesn't show a Godward orientation, you can't expect. If you think about life as a whole, there's always this principle of deterioration. You reap when you sow the wind, you reap the whirlwind, right? That you may be doing things at a certain level. Not all of that may make its way down to your children, right? So if you can never, by the grace of God, it can be different, and we know that God sometimes pulls people out of difficult circumstances and brings them up. But why has God put these children in our homes, in Christian homes? Okay, that's because He's given them a much different situation than, say, your typical child who's brought up. We have testimonies of some of our brothers and sisters in CBF who were brought up, with fathers who were drunkards or who were wife abusers and all these kind of things. And we hear from them how that scarred them, okay? And then we see that God in His grace still reaches out and pulls them out, okay? But, I believe that God has placed our children in our homes, with the intent that we will model the right things to them. He's given our children a blessing, and that blessing is that they are placed in a Christian home. They are placed in a home where the father and mother know the Lord, okay? And so how sad it is if we don't live our lives as parents, as husbands and wives, in a way that shows, the love of God, that shows the grace of God to our children. We are taking that position of advantage, okay, and destroying it completely, right? And God may still be gracious. He might still bring them through it, through various means. But we have squandered an opportunity, if we don't model this kind of Godward orientation to our children, okay? And, we'll just close with an example of Joseph. And I'm just going to read, read what's in the book here. If you have the book, you can follow along on page 23, the bottom part. This is an example of Joseph and how Joseph is a biblical character who had a lot of things happen in his life. Okay, he was, the second to last son of Jacob, the patriarch, and you all know the story. But let me just read this. Biblical stories show that shaping influences are not the whole story. So here we see is making the point I said earlier, that just because things go wrong, okay, circumstances go wrong, it doesn't mean that the child has to come out on the wrong side. Okay, shaping influences are not the whole story. Think of Joseph. His childhood experience was far from ideal. His mother died while he was young. He was his father's favorite. His dreams inflamed his brother's hatred. He was further alienated from them by his father's gift of a coat that set him apart as their authority. His brothers betrayed him. He was thrown into a pit. Opportunistic slave traders bought him to profit from his resale value. He was double-crossed in Potiphar's house despite his honor and his integrity. He was imprisoned. Even there, he was forsaken by those whom he had helped, like the baker and the butler. Here was a man who you would expect to be bitter, cynical, resentful, and angry. If man is only the sum total of influences that shape him, that would have been the result. So if man is only the sum total of influences that shape him, Joseph would have been a bitter, cynical, resentful and angry man. Instead, what do we find? When his brothers threw themselves on the ground, begging for mercy, Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children, and be reassured." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. This is in Genesis chapter 50, verses 19 to 21. So how do we explain Joseph? Okay, he had a lens through which he viewed all the events of life. In the midst of difficult shaping influences, he entrusted himself to God. God made him a man who responded out of a living relationship with God. He loved God and found his orientation not in the shaping influences of his life, but in the unfailing love and covenant mercies of God. So you see this, the point here, he had a lens through which he viewed all the events of life. Okay, and that's what Godward orientation is about, is having that lens, okay, that says, whatever is happening in our life, I look through that lens, and then all of a sudden it looks very different. It's like having that colored lens. If you have a blue tinted, glass, you look through it, everything has that haze of blue, right? You change the color, it looks different. We need to have those biblical lenses, okay? And our job as parents is to, provide the best shaping influences, but then also train up our child to have that lens, the lens of the Word of God, the lens of who God is, His nature, His character, right? And use that to shape their hearts, so that when they look at things in life, so that lens stays with them, and later on, when they're on their own and they're looking at life, they start looking through that lens. And it's not an easy thing, but it requires effort. It requires constant, deliberate effort on our part, and all the things we're going to talk about coming on now. Things about authority and communication and the rod, correction. All of these things are about, how do you go about giving your child this lens? How do you go about developing a Godward orientation? Okay, and frankly, the advantage that all of you have, that all of us have as parents who know the Lord, who desire to live for the Lord, is that presumably we are supposed to live by this lens. We have this advantage, that we know what this is, so that we can give this to them. Think of all the children who don't have that, right? And what an advantage our kids are at because of this. But then, the flip side of that is that we often, we lose that advantage. Okay, we, by our own actions, by our own sort of adoption of worldly standards, by responding to circumstances in our life in a worldly way, our children pick that up, right? And then you're sort of marring that lens. The lens of Godward doesn't look, it's not as clear anymore. Okay, it becomes a faded mirror, right? And if you're not looking at things that way, if you're not teaching them to look at things that way, they start looking at it from a worldly way, and then instead of a Godward orientation, they start building these little idols in their life. Okay, so that's pretty much what I had to cover in the lesson today. And next week we'll talk about you're in charge. Please do read chapter 4. I don't see any questions, so I don't know if anybody wants to jump in and make some comments. Maybe you have some illustrations or examples from your own life where you have seen, and some of the things you've done to give your children a Godward orientation. Please do share. I know everybody's hesitant, but the more that you share about these things and your experiences, I think that will be an encouragement to others. So I'll just open it up. Anybody wants to jump in and ask any questions or share? Again, we're just setting the foundations here. We'll start getting into the more practical parts later. Press of the mute button. Charlie.
Georgian. Coming to shaping influences, I think one of the things that I have found to be effective is when we take certain decisions for the family. The kids often, they have a different way of seeing as to what is right and wrong. And sometimes instead of, the natural tendency is to just brush them aside and say, no, this is what we are going to do. But sometimes I've seen that just sitting and explaining to them as to why certain decisions are taken, and what is the lens that we are putting on when we are making a decision, actually helps them to reason as well. We may not convince them with our first decision, but eventually, as they see how we are taking decisions, I have seen that they are also, over a period of time, able to understand that, okay, this is how decisions are taken in this way. There is a principle behind it. So I've seen that work.
Yeah. So Charlie, you're absolutely right. Thank you for sharing that, because it's even in the small decisions, right? And the more they see that, and what they learn by that is the example is that for you, the way we make this decision is what is the the driver behind it, right? What is the force? What is the motivation behind it? Why do we decide to do this thing or not do that thing, or go in this direction or not in that direction? And very often we make the mistake of thinking that children don't understand. We undervalue their capacity to pick things up. But you're actually absolutely right. To the point I made about them learning from our example, the more they see us making decisions guided by the word of God, even decisions like where we send them to school, right? So, for example, you're sending them to a particular school, and I know there have been some parents here, who were sending their children to a certain school, and they felt like, the kind of stuff being taught there, right, was wrong, in a particular direction from a religious perspective or whatever, right? It was teaching the wrong things, and they took a decision to take them out of that school and put them somewhere else, right? Discussing that with them and helping them understand the basis, the foundation on which we make decisions, that develops that Godward orientation in them. And you start that at a young age so that they start building up that knowledge, okay? I have a private question here. What if you yourself have been through emotional trauma or abuse as a child and carried on later in life as well? How do you then parent a child in a way that is not affected by your baggage? Yeah. So thank you to the person who asked that question. And I mentioned the example of people who didn't grow up in a home like a godly home, a believing home, a Christian home, and have been through this trauma. And that's exactly why the whole point of this lesson really addresses that, right? So it is that shaping influence, and you need to be aware, right, of that shaping, how your shaping influences might be getting reflected in the way that you are dealing with the children. So remember the point I made here, right? The shaping influence is not, I think it's in, if I can go back to the slides there. What I talked about, the mistake, right? The mistakes on shaping influences, assuming the child is a helpless victim of the circumstance in which he was raised. Okay, so I'll just expand that to say, assuming that because you went through that circumstance, therefore you and your next generation, everybody is going to be scarred. Okay, the good news is that if you are now in Christ, okay, Christ has forgiven you, right? He has taken you out of that circumstance, right? And he has given you a new life. Okay, number one. Number two, that this can have an impact, and therefore you go and you appeal to the grace of God, and you're cognizant about this danger, and you prayerfully make your decisions, and you get counsel. You immerse yourself in the Word of God, and you cry out to God for His mercy. That, what, God, I was brought up with the abuse. I experienced abuse. Please, and you pray and ask for the grace of God that you would be, you would not reflect that in your relationship with your children, right? That baggage, understanding that baggage can translate and impact your children. If we start saying, using that past as a reason why to justify what we're doing or not doing with our children, then, you go into that danger zone, right? So it's very important, I think the rest of the questions, but it's sort of scary to even think that I would make a good parent. I guess the main thing is much prayer. That's absolutely right. So you answered your own question there. Just keep in mind, let's not discount the grace of God. Okay? God has brought you out of that, right? He has given you new life. He has adopted you as a child, despite your background. He doesn't hold that against you. And so we are not, we don't have to be slaves to our past, okay? And God can break you free of that. But having said that, you're absolutely right. It requires much prayer, and it requires that awareness, right? Awareness of the dangers of my past coming in and interfering. It requires that you and your husband, that both of you understand this, you understand what you have been through, and that you have that strong relationship and you serve as a guard on each other, right? To be able to prevent these kind of, the experience of the past from becoming something, becoming a danger in the life of your children. Okay, good question. Any other questions or any comments? Please do share examples. If you have good examples or bad examples, it doesn't matter. Please do share.
Jachan, this is Kishore here.
Yeah, sure.
I have a question. So I think this also refers to a figure that you showed in the first session. That was authority. Authority is given, but it isn't to be executed in an authoritarian way.
Yeah.
And related to that, and being a negative influential figure in your child's life, how do you find the balance between requiring discipline and yet not being, overtly violent in that sense?
Yeah.
I find it difficult. You are either lenient and you ignore it, which is not good, or it almost seems like you're unnecessarily disciplining your child, or too many times you're disciplining your child, or you're just whacking them too many times. That's the two extremes that I find in myself.
No, you're right. So we'll talk more about that when we get to discipline. But I think that distinction is important, right? Is to do the disciplining in love and for a purpose, right? So when you're disciplining in anger, your motive can't be right. Okay, the anger of man does not bring about the righteousness of God. Okay, there's a verse that says that. So keep in mind, and that at this point I'll just say that and leave it at that, because we will dwell, or we will deal with that particular topic in detail when we get to the part about discipline. How can you discipline without anger? How can you discipline in a way that the child is still understands the motive behind it, understands the intent behind it, and they see that you're doing it out of love, right, and out of concern for them, and out of mostly and most importantly out of obedience to God, right? I am punishing you not because I am angry. I'm punishing you not because you embarrass me. I'm punishing you not because for any other reason, but I'm punishing you because you have violated the law of God and of a holy God, right? And again, that varies by age and all that kind of thing. So we'll talk more about that later. Okay. Let me just hold on 1 second. So it says, the other question I have here says, hi, children get influenced by external forces like friends in the society or classmates in the school. Their expectations sometimes could be influenced by them. Say I need an expensive bicycle with more gears. How do we set the right expectations and guide them right in those situations? Yeah. So again, this is a perfect example of that Godward orientation versus idolatry. Okay. So, why does your child, and it's actually a great opportunity to sit down and explain to your child, that says, we don't judge things, or we don't judge, we don't compare ourselves to other people, right? And again, it's not that there's anything wrong with buying a cycle for a child. Certainly children have desires. Certainly we have a desire to give them certain things to enjoy themselves. Nothing wrong with that, right? But the important thing is what is the attitude we're developing in the child, right? So if every time the child comes and says, my friend does this, get me this, you do it, then you're actually teaching the child that whatever his whims and fancies are, whatever his wants are, we're always willing to give it to him. Okay? And that is going to create a major problem later on, because that whole thing of wanting becomes an idol in and of itself. So that's a great opportunity that you have to ask yourself, okay, now it's not that therefore every time the child wants something I say no. Okay, maybe it is that I say no at that point in time, but later I get it. You got to look at your own situation. Can I afford it? Right? Go back to the lesson on finances. Can I? And then even if I can afford it, what message am I sending to the child? Okay, and maybe you got something for him last time, but now you say, you know what? It's not good. This is not, this is not the right way to look at things. That whenever we want something, we just go out and get it, right? And that's a great opportunity to teach them that, this is God's money that God has given us. It doesn't belong to us, right? So let's ask ourselves this question, is this something that God really wants? And then you can encourage the child to pray. Okay, pray that, you want a bike, you submit your desire to the Lord. Okay, bike or whatever it is, okay? You submit that desire to the Lord and you maybe give them a chance, because I've heard stories of parents who maybe couldn't afford something, but they asked the child to pray, and then, a few months later, somebody brought them a gift, of that. And you can just imagine what that does to the child versus you just giving it to them and them praying and the Lord answering that prayer, right? And if the Lord doesn't answer the prayer, you tell them, you teach them then that, the Lord is sovereign. He knows what's best for you, and maybe He doesn't want you to have a bike at this point in time, right? He's using bike as an example. So these are, as we go through this lesson, you'll find that, the way you train children is not, Deuteronomy 6 says, when you sit down, when you stand up, when you walk by the way, right? It's not just formal teaching. You have to teach them in the flow of life, right? And this is a great example to teach them and bring that Godward orientation into their thinking in the flow of life. So these are great opportunities when you're children. So you should get upset at your child and scold them because they keep coming back and saying, well, Johnny's got this, or, somebody's got this. Can I have it, right? Can I have that? And my kids say this all the time. Can I get a better computer? Can I get a better phone? Can I get that? Can I get this? Right? And, think of all of these as teaching opportunities, because it should not be surprising that your child, is selfish. It's not be surprising that your child always wants whatever it pleases them. Okay? Because after all, they're sinners, right? Their orientation is towards themselves. It's towards selfishness, right? And our job is to shepherd their heart away from that, towards the godly orientation. Okay. So I would take these as great opportunities, and thank the Lord for them, and then ask the Lord to give you wisdom to deal with. Okay. For a while. So I think it's almost 12:45, so I want to wrap it up. Please do read chapter 4 in the book. Okay. As I said, chapter 4 is you're in charge, and this is all about authority. Okay, and what it means to have authority in the home. And then after that, the following week, we'll study about examining your goals. So please read this chapter. It's not a very, very long chapter, as I said. It's about 10 pages, maybe about 10 pages. So please read chapter 4 in the book before next week. And if you have other questions, feel free to send them to me by WhatsApp or whatever. Okay? Thank you, everyone.